Welcome to today's episode of the Normalized Surrogacy Podcast by Surrogacy Mentor. I'm your host, Carrie Flamer-Powell, experienced gestational surrogate, surrogacy agency founder, and owner of Surrogacy Mentor, where our aim is to help surrogates match with reputable surrogacy agencies for a safe, ethical, and enjoyable surrogacy journey. Today, I am happy to welcome our special guest, Rachel Loftspring of the Family Law and Fertility Law Group. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Yes, nice to chat with you. So today we are going to be talking about Surrogacy Legal 101. So an overview of the surrogacy legal process for surrogates. And before we dig into that, I want to give a little bio on Rachel. So Rachel is a partner at the Family Law and Fertility Law Group. Her practice focuses on family building through surrogacy, as well as egg, sperm, and embryo donation. She also protects same-sex families through step-parent adoptions and parentage actions. As a fertility law attorney, Rachel is a trusted advisor to clients from the United States and around the world on family building. Her clients are intended parents and gestational carriers, recipients and donors, adopting parents and consenting parents, individuals and couples, and all sexual orientations and gender identities. She graduated from the University of Pennsylvania Law School and is licensed to practice law in Ohio, Illinois, and Kentucky. Outside of her legal work, Rachel recently published her debut children's book, Mila the Maker and the 200-Piece Jigsaw Puzzle. It's a story about big emotions told within the context of puzzle making. And yes, its main character, Mila, is dressed in rainbow pride colors. Well, that sounds like a really cool book, so I definitely want to hear more about that in our chat today. So first, let's say, again, welcome. And we are going to talk about Surrogacy Legal 101. So can you just walk us through just a general overview and the initial steps of the surrogacy legal process from the surrogate's perspective?
Sure. So there are a lot of professionals involved in a surrogacy journey, and legal is one of them. And so we tend to get involved after a match has been made, after medical clearance has been issued, after mental health clearance has been issued. We're kind of the last stop before they can then move forward with embryo transfer. And so we're doing essentially two things in the legal process. We are drafting a contract that will serve as the roadmap for the surrogacy journey. So we lay out all the possibilities that could happen. We lay out, exactly what is going to occur if this happens, if that happens. We talk about the doctors involved. We talk about compensation. We talk about expenses. Really, we want to address any situation that can come up ahead of time so that we negotiate it ahead of time before they then dive into the agreement. So that's one piece of legal. And then the second thing that we are doing is, and states vary dramatically in terms of surrogacy law, but generally speaking, when a woman delivers a child, she is presumed to be the mother. And so we are having to rebut that presumption in different ways, depending on the jurisdiction, so that everybody knows surrogate is not the mother, her spouse or partner is not the other parent, and that the intended parents are the parents.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So a lot covered in the whole legal process. So really it's taking all of the things that we want to make sure are protecting all parties, as well as the child and the parentage of the child, and contemplating all of that in a legal agreement. And it's a lot, right? It's a lot.
It is a lot to address, but it's all in one place. And I think having it all in one place, because there are so many different elements that need to be pulled together. What is the health insurance? Who are the doctors? All of these different elements in one document. It really does provide a plan then on the go forward.
Right. Okay. Awesome. Okay. So what role does obviously we know what role the contract plays, but what are some of the key components that surrogates should be focused on when reviewing the contract? Obviously, the whole contract needs to be reviewed, right. But what are some of the key components that you go over with the surrogate that are maybe a little more important to take some extra time looking at?
Well, when we do it, and so let me just tell you, kind of back up and tell you the process. So for a surrogate, generally the intended parent's attorney will draft the agreement, and they are drafting, if there's a matching program or an agency involved, they're taking that information. So there's usually a comp sheet, there's usually a match sheet, and they are putting it into the agreement. And then once the intended parents approve the draft of the agreement, it is then coming over to the attorney for the gestational carrier, who then should be going over the agreement with her. And so the way I do it is I take that agreement and I review it. I review it word for word, and I start my process of making red lines because I always have changes to the agreement. Intended parents' attorney is writing an agreement for them, and my job is to make sure that the surrogate's best interests are represented. And even though the parties have the same end goal, there are interests on the two sides that are different. And so we want to make sure that all those interests are represented. And so I go through it in red line, and then I ask her to also review it, her spouse or partner also to review it. And then the three of us sit down together. And yes, I do need the spouse or partner there. That sometimes comes up because that person is also a party to the agreement, and that person has requirements pursuant to the agreement. So we want them to know what is going on. So when we sit down to review the agreement, I am then going through it page by page. I want to make sure that they understand everything that's in it. So yes, the big things, it's the intended parent's embryo, it's being transferred into her uterus. What does that process look like? What's expected of her? Obviously, she's not the parent, but we have that conversation. What she knows about intended parents. Does she have full informed consent? I think it's very, very important that she does. I'm also asking, do they have any questions? Because the contract is the time to really dig into the details. A lot of the times there's been great conversations and a lot of big picture conversations. The contract's like, all right, well, this is the document that we're going to follow. So let's dig in and make sure that devil's in the details, like this is okay for everybody. And so we're going through it. We're talking about, will there be donor gametes used? She should know that as well because it's going into her body. She needs to know what the doctor might be asking of her. Who is she going to follow? Are there going to be vaccines? That is something that we negotiate. What do the parties feel about termination? And by that, I mean abortion and selective reduction. Making sure the parties are on the same page about that, and also making sure that they understand the applicable law and what it means to the agreement. We're talking about her health insurance because health insurance, making sure that the surrogate is covered medically during the agreement is very important. We're making sure that we have an understanding of who the doctors are, not just the fertility clinic, but also the OB, where she's going to deliver. Travel limitations. Travel becomes very important because we probably will talk about the laws vary dramatically state by state. So we want her delivering in the jurisdiction, and by jurisdiction, I mean state, where we anticipate where she's going to get a birth order. And then also we want her delivering at the hospital that's anticipated because that's going to be in network. We are, of course, talking about compensation and expenses. When there's a matching program or agency, I am checking to make sure that the intended parent's attorney wrote it in exactly as was expected. There can also be a lot of wiggle room in those conversations. So as an example, surrogates, I look at the financial piece in kind of two buckets. You've got the base comp bucket, and then you've got all the expenses. So intended parents will cover expenses. That is something that we either get from the agencies or is negotiated. And also they will pay a base compensation for the pregnancy, not for a child, for the pregnancy. And so there can be a lot of wiggle room in this, even when we get from a match sheet, base compensation is going to be X amount. Oftentimes there's not information about, well, how will that base compensation be paid? At what point? What is the inflection point where she's going to get the full amount versus like if she has an early delivery, what she would get and how is that then determined? So those are the kinds of things that get negotiated as well. And if a surrogate, doesn't have an attorney, which should never happen, that's not necessarily something that she would know or understand how to do.
Right. And as you're talking and just flashing back to my years as a surrogacy agency owner and remembering how important it was for us as the surrogacy agency to have such a thorough match sheet and so many conversations before it ever got to legal, right? About all of the things you just mentioned, because you should never be getting to the legal process as a intended parent or surrogate and have any of these things be a surprise on either side, right? Like, oh, I didn't know that you were requesting to travel to your kids' games, or I didn't know that you wanted to use that OB. I wanted to use this OB. Like, these are things that should be contemplated early and upfront during the match.
Yeah.
Because legal is hard enough and stressful enough to not have surprises that make everyone feel blindsided. Do you have that happen a lot?
No, fortunately, but there are
Good.
gating issues that the negotiation will fall apart. If the parties aren't on the same page, there's really no amount of negotiation that's going to get there. And those gating issues tend to be termination.
Right.
You know, if the parties aren't on the same page, they're just not on the same page. And it really is not a match that should have been made or that should go forward. Vaccinations, you know, especially with the COVID vaccine, like that has become a gating issue. Also, I see this less and less, but like sometimes intended parents want to transfer more than one embryo and the doctor will say, okay, the surrogate doesn't want that. Like that can be a gating issue as well. And so, yes, we really lean on the agencies to make sure like we're not getting into a scenario where this match is going to fall apart, because then not only, you know, have the parties wasted time, they've wasted energy, they've wasted money, where really they just should have been matched with other people, because the match is very important. The people involved, it's everything.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned this, and I want to dig into it a little bit, which is how things vary state to state.
Yeah.
Obviously, we don't have time to talk about all the differences, but I think it's important for us to talk about how different the legal process for parentage, as well as maybe some of the legal components in the contract, have to be depending on what state the surrogate lives in and where the baby will be born.
Yes. So the jurisdiction, I say jurisdiction, I mean state, it varies dramatically. And let me back up for a second, because I forgot to say, and I have to say this is for informational purposes. It's not legal advice. Sorry. So if anybody has a question, they should reach out to an attorney about their case. But that really flows in nicely to this, because I'll talk about the states where I'm licensed as an example to answer your question. But folks will need to reach out to an attorney specifically about their jurisdiction. You know, we don't expect that somebody just know the laws, but they can find out that information by talking to the appropriate professional. So surrogacy law can come from case law, or it can come from statutory law. Those are kind of the two places that law come from in this country. And it's all state-based. And so I'm licensed in Ohio, I'm licensed in Illinois, and I'm licensed in Kentucky. And there are 3 different jurisdictions in the way they operate. So this is kind of a good example. Ohio has case law from the Supreme Court of Ohio, which is the highest court in Ohio, saying that surrogacy is not prohibited by public policy. They don't tell us do X, Y, Z and that equals surrogacy. Basically, they say it's not prohibited. And from that, we are able to do surrogacy, and we have developed our own process that works very well. Illinois is very different. Illinois is also, it's very surrogacy friendly. Illinois has statutory law, and it specifically lays out what needs to be in an agreement and what needs to be set up for it to constitute a surrogacy. And so in those cases, you know, it has to be drafted in a very specific way. And once that is done, then instead of going to court, which is what we do in Ohio, we have phase 1 contract, phase 2 going to court for parentage. In Illinois, we have phase 1 contract, but there's actually not a requirement to go to court. It's instead a process of filling out forms, because if you follow the statute, that's what you need to do. So that's really nice when parties are able to access Illinois. Kentucky doesn't have law at all about gestational surrogacy. And so we are following a process that we have just developed over time. So understanding what the law is in each jurisdiction is important. And then, you know, a lot of the time, the surrogacy matches will involve multiple jurisdictions. So surrogate will live and deliver in one place, intended parents live in another place, clinic might be in a different place altogether. So one of the things that the attorney should be doing is getting together and figuring out what is the best law to apply to the enforcement of the agreement? So, I might be doing an Ohio matter, but maybe there's a state and we like their law better. Or maybe IPs are from another state and they have an attorney out of that state. And so they want to use that law and the law is equal. So fine. But then we do what's called bifurcate. And we would say, okay, we're applying one law to the enforcement of the agreement. But for the parentage action, we are going to say parties agree to submit themselves to the jurisdiction of Ohio or wherever the case may be for the purpose of the uncontested parentage proceeding. And so that's how we work around the jurisdiction and the choice of law question. And really, it's a matter of figuring out, okay, where are the parties and what attorneys should be involved? And agencies will reach out all the time and they'll say, hey, I've got this set up. What do you think? It also happens that I'll get a match and they'll be like, all right, you're going to represent this surrogate or this intended parent. And I'll say, you know what? I'm really not the best person for this. They should have somebody in their state. Because to me, it's really important from an informed consent standpoint that there be an attorney who can explain what's going on in their state. So if you have a surrogate in Ohio, I want to know that she understands what it means to have an Ohio surrogacy. I want to know that she understands what our abortion laws are, what our life support laws are. And so boots on the ground is really, really important in the contract phase and then also in the parentage phase.
Yeah. I was just speaking on another episode recently with an attorney, and we were talking at length about how important it is to have an experienced family law attorney, specifically experienced in surrogacy for a surrogacy journey, because it's such a niche part of law and such a niche thing in general that you've got to understand all the intricacies, and you don't want your cousin's best friend's real estate attorney doing your surrogacy contract.
Well, not only that, I mean, I think that's a huge part of it, but I find that it can be much less efficient for everybody. And then it's either less efficient or somebody's rubber stamping something. Neither of those is a good thing.
Right. Yeah, for sure. So let's switch gears just a little bit and let's talk about your book that you wrote. Tell me about what is it about and why did you write it?
Well, thank you. Yes. So I recently wrote a book called Mila the Maker and the 200-Piece Jigsaw Puzzle. And like you said, it is a story about managing big emotions told within the context of puzzle making. I wrote it because I realized as a parent, I've got two kids, Mila, who inspired the book, but it's not about her. She wants me to tell everybody that because she's embarrassed about the part where the kid throws all the puzzle pieces on the floor. So I've got Mila, who's 10, and a son who's 7. And I realized as a parent, one of the best lifelong skills I could teach my kid was how to manage big emotions and how to appropriately wield them. And so there's a process that the book uses, and it's basically a process that works in my family. So I wrote the book to share with other families what works for us. And essentially, Mila, the maker, gets a puzzle from her mom, and she's so excited. She's got a plan, and she puts the plan in place, and it all just goes haywire. And she gets super upset, and she throws it all on the floor. And she's just having all these big feels of I can't do it. This is too much for me. And then she learns this strategy to not react to feelings, but instead to sit with them and to pause and then to figure out an action, a next best step. And so that's what she does. And the book goes through, how she starts again with the puzzle making process, and it's hard and she's able to do it. And she works and works. And finally she makes the puzzle, and she's so proud of herself, but she's proud not just because she made the puzzle, but because she learned this lesson, and it's been this great journey. And so it's kind of a timely book with Inside Out 2 coming out, and a lot of talk about big emotions. And it's been really fun. So thank you for asking about that.
Yeah, that sounds great. And so people can go to the links in this episode to find the book and find information about you. So that's really neat.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So let's switch gears back to the legal process. So tell me about some of the most common challenges that come up with the legal process once you get into sort of the thick of the legal negotiation process between surrogates and intended parents.
One thing I think is really important for surrogates to think about is how this is going to impact their life and making sure that what's built into the contract really does work for them. So, how is childcare set up? How is housekeeping set up? What are the travel limitations? It is always a balance between what is needed for the surrogacy and then also for her. How is it going to impact her work, her lost wages? Really understanding and hopefully from mental health evaluations and counseling and also agency, like some of this is done already, but making sure that those expectations are drafted appropriately into the agreement is really important. I think sometimes surrogates are annoyed when I have to have both parties on our phone or Zoom conversation. It can be hard for people to schedule. I completely get that, which is why, I will do nights and weekends because a lot of people work during the day and we want to make sure that everybody is on the phone call and can ask the questions. But it is so important that everybody in the agreement understand the agreement. Sometimes there's conversations about like sexual activity and what that looks like. Occasionally I see intended parents who, want more limitations than are typical. And so how does that work? Organic fruits and vegetables. Sometimes that's no big deal. Sometimes that can be really hard depending on where a surrogate lives. So these are the kinds of details that we are working through that I'm highlighting and making sure that there's really an understanding of, because we don't want to get to a situation where she's 5 months pregnant and she did something or didn't do something and it was like, oh, it was in the agreement and we didn't know about it.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned this a couple times and I just want to highlight it that I don't know that many women just starting their surrogacy process or research realize that their husband, wife, partner, spouse has to be legally involved as well as practically involved, right? There's going to have to be medical tests that are done, lab tests, STD screenings. They're going to have to be involved in the psychological evaluation. They're going to have a criminal background check, and they're going to have to be included in the legal contract as well as also in some states the parentage process, right? Because if they have a male partner or husband, in some states, correct me if I'm wrong, that the husband also has to release his any inkling of his parentage rights to the child, right?
In all the states where I practice, we need both of them.
Got it. Yeah. So I think knowing up front that it's not something you can just do on your own as a surrogate, your partner is going to have to be very involved and supportive. And that's why we say not only for emotional purposes, but for practical and legal purposes, your partner has to be completely on board.
That's right. And when I have a single surrogate, we'll even address like if she were to marry during the course of the contract, what that looks like. I mean, some contracts will say like she can't marry. Other contracts will say the agreement has to be amended, and it has to be amended to then include that person because it impacts the parentage process down the road.
Right. And when we've had, with my agency previously, when we've had single surrogates, there's also has to be a contemplation in the contract about what if she wants to date or be sexually active while she's pregnant as the surrogate or in the process of getting pregnant as the surrogate. And these are things you don't necessarily think of initially, but when you start thinking, yeah, if someone was carrying my child and they were dating multiple people, I'd want to have some idea of what protection was being used or what are the parameters here of making sure baby and surrogate are safe.
Absolutely. And testing for sure.
Right. Yeah. So things that maybe people don't think about, you are really digging into those things in the legal process, because the way I think about it is any legal contract, but especially in surrogacy, and you can tell me if you agree with this or not, is we're sort of hoping for the best, but anticipating the worst. And so we're thinking about all the things that maybe could go wrong or that could, someone could get hurt, or we're trying to think of what would we do in those scenarios or what can we do to avoid those scenarios. And let's put all that into an agreement so that we've tried to anticipate all the things we possibly can, and it's all there.
That's right. I mean, it really protects everybody and provides a roadmap for the surrogacy. So we've thought about it all ahead of time, as opposed to, oh gosh, now we're in it and something came up and now we're trying to figure out what we're going to do.
Yeah, 100%. So what's some parting advice that you would give to surrogates specifically who are either just getting started in their research to be a surrogate, or maybe they're already matched and they're getting ready to enter the legal process? What's some parting words of wisdom that you would give to them?
So one of my favorite things that I hear is when a surrogate or intended parent calls me and they're like, I am talking to several attorneys. I think that is great because yes, you want somebody experienced for the reasons that you said earlier. And you want somebody who has a good reputation, and you need somebody who's the right fit. Not everybody is the right fit. And so by her going out and talking to different people and kind of getting a sense for how folks work and who might be best for them, I think is so important. And that's not necessarily something that somebody can tell you. That's something that you discover by doing the footwork yourself and having those conversations. And any attorney should be willing to hop on an introductory call and chat with you and tell you, you know, what the law is in that state, what their process is, so that you have a feeling for what that person is like.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice, because the same goes for your whole journey, right? You want an agency or someone that's helping you through the journey that feels like the right fit. You want a match that feels like the right fit. You want to see an OB that feels like the right fit. Like, all of these things need to feel like this is a team member that I'm adding to my team for this journey, and they are a good fit for me personality-wise. You know, the way we communicate, all of those things need to line up, and the same is true for the legal process. So I think that's a good point. Awesome. Well, I am just so happy to have chatted with you today, and thank you so much for your time. And hopefully our listeners got some good information today about the legal process.
Well, thank you. This has been such a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you. So that brings us to the end of this episode of the Normalized Surrogacy podcast. Again, I'm your host, Carrie Flamer Powell. I want to again thank our special guest, Rachel, for joining me today. Be sure to check out the links in this episode to see how you can contact Rachel directly and check out her book as well. And then also be sure to check us out online at surrogacymentor.com. If you're interested in knowing whether surrogacy is right for you, take our easy 2-minute quiz on our website. You can also learn more about intended parent mentoring and matching services at modernparentmentor.com. Subscribe to this podcast to learn more about gestational surrogacy and how to have a safe, ethical, and enjoyable surrogacy journey. Talk to you next time.